Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I am Daniel, and I am the co-chair of the 31st Asia Business Conference this year, the co-chair for the conference side.
Yep, and hello everyone, welcome to the 31st Asia Business Conference. My name is Cynthia and I am the panel co-chair for this year's ABC. So now let's begin our keynote session for tonight. So ABC, it's the longest student-run conference in North America that focuses on Asia business. And this year is both the 31st year of our student organization as well as our 31st annual conference. It is also the second online conference that we have held since the beginning of the pandemic. And for this year's conference, we have more than 30 speakers who are from renowned companies, including, but are not limited to, companies such as PayPal, BCG, Bain, JP Morgan, and American Enterprise Institute. And we'd like to give special thanks to our platinum sponsors. So these are the sponsors that have provided significant support to our conference this year. And these sponsors include the Ross BBA Council, the Michigan Ross Global MBA Program, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, as well as the Mitsui Life Financial Research Center. And in addition to our platinum sponsors, we have also received great support from the following sponsors, including the Michigan Ross China Initiatives, the NUM Center for Korean Studies, the Ross Patent Accounting Center, Center for Japanese Studies, as well as the LSA Staff Department. And of course, we also want to thank our audience for all your support over the past 3 decades, and also the support of our wonderful team. And here is a quick reminder of how to access our conference schedule and the different links. So to access the schedule and links, you can visit our website at abcross.org. If you have already RSVP'd through Eventbrite, our operations team have sent out emails containing the detailed logistics as well as the conference booklet. But in case you haven't had an opportunity to take a look at the booklet yet, our operations team will actually be sending it out right now in the chat so that you could download and take a quick look. And you will also be able to view the recordings on our YouTube channel afterwards. And on the right-hand side, you can see our agenda for this year's conference. And similar to our last year's conference, in order to accommodate the different time zones for our speakers and the audience across the globe, the conference is divided into 2 weekends and into 4 days. So today is the week 1, day 1, and followed by our keynote speech is the finance panel. And tomorrow we'll have 3 panel discussions. And then next week we'll be having our second keynote speech with the remaining 4 panel discussions. And now I'll pass it over to Daniel to quickly discuss the Zoom instructions for Q&A.
Right, so I'm just gonna cover some basic logistics. So for tonight, for our keynote session, we will be conducting our Q&A session after Dr. Scissor's speech and using the Zoom Q&A function. So please click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen of Zoom and type in your question and send it over so our panelists could read it and will help answer the question. And please do not send any message in the chat box. And now I would like to introduce Interim Dean Francine Lafontaine, who will be giving us an opening speech today. Dean Lafontaine is a William Davidson Professor of Business Administration and also a Professor of Business Economics and Public Policy. Dean Lafontaine is a distinguished scholar and educator with extensive experience as a faculty member, researcher, and administrator. And she also has a long and prestigious record of service to the university and to the business and economic community. In addition to her contributions in education, Dean Lafontaine has also served as the director at the Bureau of Economics for the US Federal Trade Commission, as well as a co-editor of the Journal of Economic and Management Strategy since 1997, and the Journal of Law, Economics, and Organization from 2006 to 2012. In this first year, as we enter our 4th decade of conference, it is an honor to have Dean Lafontaine to speak for us for the first time at the Asia Business Conference, leading us into an exciting brand new era. So we are truly grateful to have Dean Lafontaine here with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for this wonderful introduction, and also Cynthia for all this information about the conference. It's nice to see both of you and learn more about what the program looks like. So In my role as interim dean for the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan, I am very, very pleased to have the opportunity to speak at this conference. Celebrating its 31st offering is pretty amazing, and you should all be very proud about that. I will also be very happy to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight. Before I do that, I just want to mention that this conference has been bringing leaders of large organizations with operations throughout the world and knowledgeable experts on issues related to economics and the business environment in Asia throughout all these years that it's been functioning. So, but in addition to bringing wonderful speakers to the business school, this conference also affords attendees the opportunity to network with these speakers through panel discussions and various networking sessions as well. So I think it's an incredible opportunity for you to learn more about Asia and the economics and the economic environment there, but it's also a wonderful thing to have here specifically at the Ross School of Business. So I'm going to just thank the students for putting that together each year like that. With that, let me turn to our distinguished keynote speaker for tonight. So Dr. Scissors is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on the study and understanding of the Chinese and Indian economies and US relationship with Asia. He's also currently serving on the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission and as the chief economist of the China Beige Book, which is an organization that focuses on providing credible data on operations in China. Dr. Scissors has also written many articles about economic development in India, and he has served in a number of roles that have allowed him to develop really interesting insights about India, about Asia, and economic activities there. So I think he is here to share his insights developed through all of these activities, and I think that you will find his comments particularly useful. Importantly, before I turn things over to him, I want to mention that he is an alumnus of the University of Michigan. So we are proud to welcome him back here to the university. Since I know everyone's looking forward to hearing his comments, let me now turn it over directly to him. Dr. Scissors, your turn.
Thank you, Dean Lafontaine. I should say that ABC has been around for a while, but I graduated from UN even before ABC was founded, which means I'm old. I mean, I'm wise and experienced. That's what I meant. There's a lot of ground to cover in such a topic, talking about Asian economy in 2022. It's a bit of a survey. Surveys can be boring. I'm going to try not to be boring. I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments because that's the most interesting part for me. I already know what I'm going to say. Let's start by the obvious thing. Asia is not a meaningful economic entity. When someone says the Asian economy, they're not being accurate. It's much too diverse in policy. Pakistan and the Republic of Korea are not part of one body, neither are Myanmar and New Zealand. It's also too large to discuss in 30 minutes. And to be blunt, it's too large for anyone to say that they're an Asia economic expert. I'm going to start with China and spend my most time on China because that's what I've studied the most. I'll also discuss India, a few smaller but still sizable countries, and then the trade deals that have been struck recently that I don't think are very important, but people talk about them a lot. And finally, the US economic role in the region, which is also, turns out not to be very important. There are a lot of interesting things that could happen in 2022 in terms of Asian economic development. Unfortunately, probably none of them will. 2022 will still feature COVID recovery, which is a positive, but it's unlikely to feature realization of a lot of the economic potential in Asia, China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, the American role in the region, you name it. I wish I could be more optimistic, but there's a reason why we call economics the dismal science. All right, so let's start with China. Later this year, the Chinese Communist Party will have its once every 5 years party congress, where it will pick members for the ruling bodies of the party, Central Committee, the Political Bureau Standing Committee, and the General Secretary. And that was from the bottom to the top, the General Secretary being on top, the Central Committee being very important, but a much larger body. Who they pick matters a lot to long-term Chinese economic policy, but it also matters to 2022, because even more than usual, the Chinese Communist Party wants economic stability this year, because there's a big political event to occur. State media are not subtle about this. They talk about the highest economic priority of stability over and over and over again. So China is actually looking to have a boring year economically. And I think they're going to succeed. But let's talk about some things that are a little less boring. Stability sounds pretty simple, but of course it means that you agree on what the situation is now. And one of the big things about studying China, you I'm sure have noticed if you spend any time studying the Chinese economy, is that people all over the world don't agree on what the situation in China is now. You will have people say that China is taking over the global economy like the US did in the 1940s. It's going to become the dominant economy. And other people saying that China is finished. Its rise is over. It's like Japan in the 90s. It had a wonderful run and now it's over. And that's, China will stagnate like Japan did in the 1990s and is still stagnant economically. So, when you say stability, what the party means by stability, what the state media mean by stability might not be what you think is stability and what you think is stable and what I think is stable. When you look at Chinese macroeconomic performance at this point early in the year and toward the end of last year, China's economy is not performing very well. It had a bounce out of COVID. It came out of COVID before any other economy, but growth has slowed sharply since then. There have been repeated price spikes for some goods and services. The Chinese labor market is very badly segmented by zero COVID. You can't go where jobs are because you can't really leave where you are very easily. And innovation has, in my opinion, been stifled by politically motivated government action. You may have been following the news where China has cracked down on the excessive pursuit of capital by technology firms, for example. We can go into more detail in that in the Q&A. But if you put those things together, slower growth, price spikes, inability for people to move around, to find work or to improve their jobs, and the questions about whether innovation will be permitted freely, you don't have a very good economic situation. And the Chinese government has two tools to change the economic trajectory. The first quarter may be bad. It's a little late to be changing the trajectory in the first quarter of the year, but it has two tools to make China more prosperous as the year goes on. The first is a tool that everybody talks about all the time now. It's monetary and fiscal stimulus. China, in my opinion, overborrowed and harmed itself. Over-leveraged would be another term. From 2009 to 2019, China reacted very strongly to the global financial crisis, pumped a lot of money into the system, wasted a lot of it. Chinese debt, which was fine in 2007, soared. Got to be worse than American debt, even though China is a lower income country. So that was a bad period. Strangely enough, in 2020 and 2021, another crisis, China seems to have learned the lessons from 2008, 2009, and it was much more responsible in terms of fiscal and monetary policy than most countries, certainly including the United States, which in my opinion has been very irresponsible with fiscal and monetary policy the last 2 years. And what that means is, because China has not been pouring so much money into the economy, they're able to do so if they want to over the course of this year. And if the Chinese economy continues to be weak in the second quarter, I think we will see more intervention from the government to temporarily boost the rate of growth and the rate of people's income growth, so that the second half of the year is stronger than the first. Stimulus doesn't work for very long. It certainly doesn't work for very long when you already are in a lot of debt. But China's period of responsibility, 2020 and 2021, sets them up to improve the economy temporarily if they want to. Stimulus has not started yet. There's some false reports today and yesterday that don't understand the data, which we can talk about if you're interested. And contrary to hopes among some Western investors, it should be mild unless it's needed for economic stability. So if China follows the stimulus path, there are some regional countries that will benefit from more exports to China, but the regional impact will also be mild. you're basically talking about a Chinese economy that will be slow, or if there's some stimulus, it'll be a little bit faster, but not much faster. It will not be a driving force in the region in terms of growth in 2022. China will still be very large. So in that sense, it's very important for the region economically, but 2022 will not see a lot of dynamism. That would not be true if China uses its second main policy choice, which is ending the zero COVID restrictions. There's a lot of pent-up demand in China, consumer demand. There's some pent-up supply. On the demand side, there's more pent-up demand than elsewhere because the restrictions have been so tight. If zero COVID were dropped a few weeks after the Olympics, for example, that would trigger a 12-month boom in both China and its regional partners. So if you're talking about what could make 2022 more exciting, because I don't think 2022 will be very exciting or very beneficial economically, China dropping zero COVID would do it. It would cause a boom in China and a boom in its closer economic partners in Asia. Unfortunately, this is unlikely. China's been very, very cautious about COVID. It's watching what's going on in Hong Kong now with rising Hong Kong cases and hospitalizations. And China has very good reason to be cautious about COVID. It has a large population of older people who tend to be more vulnerable to COVID strains. Lung damage is common in the Chinese population due to both pollution and smoking. So those people with lung damage may be more vulnerable to serious COVID illness. And China has stated openly that it fears a wave of serious COVID cases that would overrun rural healthcare in particular. So those are real concerns, and it may mean that China doesn't lift zero COVID, at least not in the next 6 months. We could see more selective easing in areas where healthcare is stronger. We've already seen that to some extent. It doesn't get talked about much because it seems quite unfair that some places have tighter restrictions than other places, even though the rules are supposed to be the same for everyone. As an economist, and I'm hoping that zero COVID restrictions get lifted to some extent because it will help the Chinese economy, the regional economy, and the global economy. That may not be the smart thing to do when you look outside of economics, and that will be up to the Chinese leadership to decide. If they don't lift restrictions or they lift them only mildly, you're going to get an economy that improves when this happens. Second quarter, third quarter, will be one of those two. The economy will improve. It won't improve a lot. If you're the Republic of Korea, if you're Japan, if you're Malaysia, if you're Australia, you're going to have a stronger Chinese economy to partner with, but it won't be much stronger. So that would be kind of the boring good news. It's a little, the Chinese economy is a little better than it was in the second half of last year. That's good for Asia in general, but it's not a strong performance. It's not a dynamic performance, and it doesn't really lift up China's partners in the region very much. India. I'm not going to go into as much detail for India. I like talking about India. So if people want to ask questions about it, that's great. India just doesn't matter as much to other countries in the region, not all of them, most of other countries in the region, as China does. Its trade and financial ties to the rest of Asia are much smaller than China's. Why do we talk about India then? Because China has been slowing really since 2010. If you look at either official growth or independent measures of growth, China's economy has been slowing. There was the sharp drop because of COVID and then a quick bounce out of COVID. But if you take COVID out, the trend is for the Chinese economy to be slowing for more than a decade now. And the only country that could replace China, both in terms of driving regional growth and then becoming an important global engine for global growth, is India. The population size does that. The potential for very fast growth. The US is a very large economy. It's not going to grow as fast as China has in the past, and India could grow. Other countries that could grow quite quickly don't have India or China's size. So we watch India for a very good reason, but it doesn't look like we're going to be happy with how India is doing in 2022. India might be happy, but its partners will not be happy because India's performance will not be strong enough to also help them. India is still recovering from COVID, and that will last into this year. India's economic performance this year will be fine, but its policies are such that the big surprise, the wow, powerhouse Indian development, we're really going to see India, start to actually replace what China brought to the table in terms of the global economy in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. That I don't think we're going to see. And I'll go into a little detail about that. India really likes to talk about being the Indian press, the Indian government really likes to talk about being the fastest growing major economy in the world. And it could be the fastest growing major economy in the world in 2022. The Indians use a different fiscal year, but that is definitely possible. It will almost certainly outpace China in 2022, which is also something India cares a lot about. But the first question you have to ask about Indian growth is if growth is so impressive, why is the central government still borrowing so much money? India reports a government deficit, revenue deficit, that as a share of GDP is larger than the United States. The United States is already ridiculously large amount of borrowing every year. And India's is even larger as a share of GDP, and it's much larger than China's. Normally, you don't borrow when your economy is doing well, you borrow when your economy is doing poorly. So if China is growing slower than India, which it very likely is and probably will for the course of the year, why is it borrowing less? One of the reasons is that India is exaggerating its real growth. That is, it's reporting a real GDP growth using a GDP deflator that underestimates true inflation. There's plenty of evidence this is happening in India. It's something that happens in a lot of developing countries in the past and in present. You can make an argument that the US exaggerates its real GDP growth because we don't measure the price of services properly, meaning health and education. So this is one explanation for why India can say, hey, we're the fastest growing major economy, but we need to borrow a lot of money. The more important explanation, the less statistical explanation, the more policy explanation is that Indian economic policy is poor. No country has ever become rich with state control of agriculture. That applies to China too. There are no rich countries where the state controls the agricultural sector. But India recently dropped an attempt to gradually move farmers off the government dole, government price supports, in return for giving them more freedom and opportunities to sell their crops. In other words, liberalizing agriculture, making it more market-driven rather than state-driven, and they abandoned it. There is talk, just talk at this point, but there is talk of India going backward and tightening labor rules, such as the ability of companies to fire workers. That's something to note in particular, because if you're a company and you have to have government permission to fire workers, you're not going to hire them because it's too risky. You hire them and then something bad happens, you need to fire them, the government won't let you, and now your company goes out of business. So these restrictions on the labor market that India puts in to protect workers, they protect existing workers, but they make it much harder for new workers to find jobs. Labor markets are already too restricted. They need to be liberalized. India wants possibly to restrict them more. And in the current situation, the huge young labor force that India always talks about, the reason why India could replace China, as a growth engine in the world economy, there's no place for them to go. Firms won't hire them because firms are afraid of hiring young workers and then having a setback and the government not allowing them to fire the young workers. So, Indian policy means that, okay, there's a COVID recovery going on in India, which is good. 2022, we'll see good Indian economic performance. But in 2023, we'll be back for India saying it's doing well and it's going to do well and India is rising and all the things that the Indian government says. But there's no reason to expect that because land policy is still backward, labor policy is still too restrictive. India is not yet a rich country, so it's hard for capital to drive growth. That's why the Indian government has to borrow so much. So when I look at India, I think 2022 is going to be fine. But when the COVID recovery is over, India is in the same situation it was before COVID, which is underperforming because it's not willing to take the necessary structural reform steps. And that underperforming India, starting as it does with not being as big and not being as important in China, is not going to be able to affect the regional economy very much. Certainly, India has some close economic partners like Bangladesh, and a good Indian economic performance this year will help Bangladesh. But we're not going to get what we really all hope for from India, which is a true boom, the way China had in the 90s and the 2000s, because India has not adopted the necessary policies. So if you're not depressed enough, I will talk about some other countries in Asia. China is no longer a powerful engine for growth in Asia. It's very large, but it's not growing quickly anymore. India doesn't seem to want to become a powerful engine. Japan and South Korea are old. So where would we turn? People have talked about this a lot, Southeast Asia. And I say Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, so I can say VIP countries not because that's in any particular sensible order. All of three of them have at least 100 million people in terms of populations. Indonesia is well above the other two at 270 million. They're all considerably younger than the Northeast Asian countries that people usually focus on, China, Japan, South Korea. They were all posting respectable growth before COVID and seem to be returning to that after COVID. There are different situations in different countries, so that countries will return to their trend lines at different speeds, but they were all growing pretty well in 2019. You can't actually even group these countries together in terms of policy, much less every country in Asia. Vietnam is working to gain from companies leaving China. China is less hospitable to some companies than it used to be. I mentioned the crackdown on technology companies, for example. There are some U.S. actions that are encouraging companies to leave China. Vietnam is looking for some of those companies to relocate. Now, Vietnam cannot possibly absorb a large-scale exodus of companies from China. China is much, much bigger. But they can take some of those companies, and that will help boost foreign investment. It will create jobs, bring technology and capital, and that should boost Vietnamese economic growth. The Philippines should be doing that as well. It's about the same size as Vietnam in terms of population. It is a treaty ally of the United States, which is helpful in terms of some potential partners in Asia. But in terms of the leadership of the Philippines for the past 5.5 years, they've been led by someone who just talks a lot and does not make good economic policy. He is supposed to leave soon, I think in June. So we have an opportunity for the Philippines to implement better economic policies, for the growth, which is already quite good, to accelerate, for the Philippines to actually become a boom country. Now, the Philippines cannot obviously replace China or India because its population is so much smaller, but it could be quite a bright spot if the current government gets out of the way and a new government is willing to be more dynamic. Indonesia is really the great prize in Southeast Asia, with a much younger population than China or Japan, and with a very large population. We'll soon get to 300 million people. Indonesia has been unable to stick to reform policies. They talk about them a lot, pro-competition, pro-property rights reforms, but they've been unable to hold to them. And a really bad development that was reinforced, it was talked about before this, but it was reinforced last month, is Indonesia announcing it's going to create a new capital. And I'll just, maybe it's the only useful thing I'll say. If you ever do any development economics, whenever a country says it's going to create a new capital, it means it's unwilling to take real reform actions. New capital is like the bridge that you smash or the bottle of champagne over. It's shiny, and then maybe someone uses it, and then it starts having maintenance problems. But for a year, it looked good. New capital is a giant version of that. It means you don't want to engage in structural reform. You're going to have a lot of construction and boost growth temporarily, but you're going to have to borrow a lot of money for it because the new capital isn't necessarily going to bring any money into the economy on a long-term basis. And so it's a discouraging sign, because if you're engaged in structural reform and you're making your economy more efficient and more productive, you don't need to build a new capital. So it would be wonderful if Indonesia became, at its size, a rapidly growing economy, but it's probably not going to. In the region itself, I've been talking about countries in the region, but in the region itself, there are two high-profile economic agreements. One is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, and one is the very unhappily named Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, Cptpp. I really wish they would have come up with a shorter name for that. They will not harm the region, certainly, but they won't help the region, not this year and not any year, in my opinion. I don't see them. They get a lot of attention, but the attention they deserve is political or diplomatic. They're not trade agreements that will change behavior, that will change the level of economic integration between countries. They're diplomatic agreements that protect the trade status quo, where countries sign on the dotted line and saying, we want to trade with each other. If you read them, instead of just listening to public relations work, which apparently most people in the press do, instead of reading the agreement, they're just minor changes. They will help small economies that are very dependent on trade, but the economies I'm talking about, certainly China, India, Indonesia, and then to a lesser extent, Vietnam and the Philippines, these agreements just won't matter. there's another issue here that has become prominent, unfortunately, which is the main reason RCEP was signed is China. China wanted the agreement, and other countries wanted market access to China. China is the biggest economy in the region, second biggest in the world. When RCEP negotiations began, China was still growing quite quickly. No one knew the direction it was going in. The Cptpp is sort of an answer to RCEP that doesn't include China, but some of the countries in the Cptpp would like to include China because it is the biggest economy. But the problem here is that we have a couple of examples now, one very prominent, where China ignores its own trade agreements when it gets upset at a country. The country I'm thinking of is Australia. Australia criticized China's behavior over COVID, and we have seen Chinese sanctions against Australia that are not very extensive, but they violate both WTO rules and China's own agreement with Australia. And that's another reason why these agreements, even though they get a lot of attention, it's hard to imagine them having much of an effect, because the big prize in the agreement, which is access to the Chinese market, the Chinese have shown they will cut that access off if you criticize them politically. And that reduces the value of the agreement for everyone involved. Last, I want to talk about the US. US policy is unfortunately somewhat similar to RCEP and Cptpp, in that the United States is trying to create new ties to Asia, called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. The Biden administration actually released policy today, a document on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. The upshot is that diplomatically this might matter, but it won't matter economically, again, to any of the larger participants. It might matter to some smaller countries. I wish that were not the case. The US would benefit from more economic engagement into at least parts of Asia, maybe not all of Asia, but certainly parts. And a lot of Asia would need safer, more stable ties with the United States. And really almost everyone who exports to the United States, which is most of Asia, could benefit from those ties. Asian supply chains that run through a number of countries, they might start in Japan, but they end up running through China, or they run Japan, then Malaysia, then Korea, then China, whatever it happens to be. They end more frequently in the US, selling to the US than for any other partner country, including all the countries in Asia. So the US recognizes that it should economically engage Asia. That's why we have the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And Asia certainly would benefit from stable economic ties to the United States. But the US has just not shown the political capacity to do anything here. What the executive, maybe this is the most useful thing I'm going to tell you if you're not paying attention to Washington, what the executive branch does, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, it doesn't matter. It doesn't work if Congress doesn't go along in trade. Presidential trade initiatives where a president signs a deal and issues an executive order but doesn't put it through Congress, they're not set in US law. They're only temporary, and they can be dropped as soon as the president, whether the current president or a new president, wants to. So, if you're a partner and the US is coming and saying, we really want you to make some changes to improve things for the United States, why would you? Until the Biden administration goes to Congress and says, we want Congress to join in our effort, their effort just isn't worth very much. It's not worth very much to the United States, and not worth very much to Asian partners in the United States, because otherwise it's temporary. It could be wiped out in 2025. Trade deals take a long time to finish. They take a long time to implement. They take a long time to have an effect. If you're talking about a trade deal being reversed in 2025, you're not going to sign it. Or if you do sign it, it will just be for a photo op. It will have no real changes. Right now, the US Congress, I work with the Congress every single day as part of my job, appears unwilling to move forward on trade. And the Biden administration is afraid to even ask. There's something called Trade Promotion Authority, which would allow the president to ask for an up or down vote on trade agreements. That's the way you get trade agreements done in the US. Otherwise, all these amendments appear in Congress, and then the countries that you sign the trade agreement with won't go along with the amendments, and the agreement dies. But the Biden administration won't even ask for the authority. Not a controversial trade deal, just the authority to submit a trade deal. So at this point, the US cannot back up its words on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which means it can't really be important to economies in Asia, not even this year. Not even in the future, much less this year. The US does have the ability to help Asian economies and help ourselves at the same time, but there's no sign of that's going to happen, despite this announcement. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework looks like RCEP and Cptpp. It's a diplomatic initiative, not an economic initiative. In terms of macroeconomic performance, the US recovery and boosted by heavy borrowing, US economy really boomed last year. Of course, that didn't reach everyone in the United States, but macroeconomically, it really boomed. That will continue to help Asia this year, but the US is already slowing, and the positive impact from US expansion on Asia is going to disappear over the course of 2022. I don't think we can sustain it. We came out of COVID, that's part of it. We spent a lot of money, that's part of it, but we can't, both of those things are ending, and we don't really have any US policy that would boost productivity and make our expansion sustainable. So let me conclude with just a couple of summary thoughts. The world was hit by COVID in different ways, and it's going to recover in different ways. And there's a bounce ongoing, global economic bounce ongoing in 2022, including in Asia, with different countries in Asia at different stages. So that's good. We needed to come out of the COVID-induced recession, and we are. But after that's over, most countries are going to find that they borrowed too much money. It may have been justified. Not arguing that it wasn't justified. COVID was a terrible tragedy to face, and it would have been worse if governments hadn't taken action. But you still borrowed a lot of money, and in some countries you borrowed a lot of money before COVID for not a good reason. So rich countries are going to find that monetary policy doesn't work anymore. They may pretend that it does, but it doesn't. In poor countries, they're going to be unable to find credit that they were able to find in 2018 and 2019. So there's a cost to that intervention during COVID. Was the benefit necessary and worth more than the cost? Maybe, but we're going to be facing the cost in 2023 in Asia and around the world. I think to sum up, Asia in 2022 is going to be fine. Countries that had a rough 2021 will come out of 2021, see some growth. And there certainly will not be a crash in 2023. But unfortunately, unless we get these positive developments, China lifting zero COVID, India adopting better economic policy, Indonesia turning to reform, the Philippines turning to reform, the US being willing to take some political risks, we're not, aging and debt in Asia is going to make 2023 a worse year, unfortunately, I think, than 2022 economically. Dismal science, that's what economics is. I wish I could give you something happier to talk about, but those are the factors that I see the Asian economy this year. And I'll take questions now. I hope there are some. And if there aren't, start asking them. That would be great. Danny, you want to remind everyone? Yeah, thanks.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, thank you so much for the great speech, Dr. Scissors. So just a reminder for all of our participants, please type in your questions in the Q&A function. You can look down below and there's like several functions at the bar. And if you click on the Q&A, you can type in your questions. And I do believe that we have one question right now. And the question is China's Belt and Road Initiative good for the global economy?
That's a really good question. I hope we get more. I will tend to give strong answers to questions. So if you're bored, please ask tough questions or make tough comments. I think yes. I'm not sure it's good for China. So what you have with the Belt and Road is there are a lot of countries that don't have the money to build power plants in remote areas away from cities. They don't have the money to build high quality roads across their country or railways that cross into another country. And the international support for that is slow. It's slow for some good reasons, environmental evaluations, but it's also slow because the bureaucracies take a long time. So what China did was step in and say, we're faster. We'll make the decision quickly. We have a political decision process that says we want to support these activities. That was true before the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road is really more of a branding for what China was already doing, led by China Development Bank. So there are definite economic gains for countries. That doesn't mean every project is going to work well. It doesn't mean that there aren't problems with certain projects. Don't get me wrong. There are a lot of projects. There are a lot of problems. There are economic gains for these countries that wouldn't be available otherwise. And when you hear about debt traps, it's usually the local government has made a mistake. I talked about building a new capital. So in Egypt, they're also building a new capital and China's helping. It's going to put Egypt into a lot of debt. That's not China's fault. Maybe they shouldn't help, but that would be very paternalistic of them. That's Egypt's decision. So I think in most cases, the Belt and Road is helpful to the host country. It costs China money. The Chinese do not get their money back in most of these projects. They lose money. And I know that because I have a data set called the China Global Investment Tracker, which I created in 2004. And we follow these projects. So I would say it's good for the global economy. It's not really good for China. It's more of a political adventure for China. And the Belt and Road kind of peaked in 2017 and it's gotten smaller since then for those reasons. It really requires the host countries to say, okay, we have another opportunity, another avenue besides the Asia Development Bank, besides the World Bank and so on. We have to be smart about it. And if host countries get smart, then I think Chinese participation will really help them and China's own losses will decline. But right now there's kind of a trade-off between benefits to many of the host countries, not all, and losses in many cases for China. And I'll just start reading other questions. What do you think is the big trend for the future in the world? Wow, I did ask for broad questions. Can't complain now. You know, I focus on economics. There are a lot of things that could be a trend for the future in other areas, certainly technology. I'm going to go with deglobalization. You know, a pandemic has that effect. It reminds everyone that, first of all, bad things can be spread as well as good things through globalization. And it reminds a lot of countries that their reliance on other countries that in a crisis will tend to their own issues first. Everybody's like that. In a crisis, you take care of your own people. But what that means for globalization is, hey, it was great to be an economic partner with you, but in a crisis, I can't rely on you and you can't rely on me. I need to be more self-reliant. So, you know, economically, I think the big trend is we're going to get countries becoming more reliant on themselves to the extent that they can, like big countries like the US and China, and more reliant on a group of close friends than they are on the global economy and global supply chains. So obviously you asked a very broad question and I gave you only one possible answer, but I think it's a very important economic answer at least. Next question is, at what point do you think China might give up on its COVID policy due to the economic burden? I was optimistic until just a few days ago that China might ease, not give up, but ease zero COVID in March due to the economic burden. Omicron appears to be, for most people, in most cases, less dangerous than Delta. It's very easy to spread, but it doesn't seem to be as serious. And so I thought China would, of course, wait for the Olympics to end, wait for people to leave, a little bit of stability there, but sometime in March, either unofficially or officially mildly ease the COVID policy and see how it goes. That is the way China does policy a lot, right? They don't take a giant dramatic step, they start with a small step. I thought it was going to work and that we would see more easing over the course of the year. Now, I'm not in Hong Kong, but it appears that Hong Kong is struggling with COVID right now, and I'm a little bit surprised at that. But whether, you know, I should be surprised and how much it's struggling, putting that aside, if Hong Kong is struggling, it's very scary for the central government in Beijing, because Hong Kong does have good healthcare. And it's not as densely populated, even though it's quite densely populated. It's not densely populated as some Chinese cities. It's richer than Chinese rural areas. If Hong Kong is struggling, then it's very hard for me to see China lifting COVID restrictions. Like last week, I might have given you a different answer. And maybe if Hong Kong's, the Omicron spike in Hong Kong declines really quickly, it has in some places, I again might be more optimistic. But Hong Kong has to be okay on COVID. China will not loosen COVID restrictions while one of its richest cities or its richest city is struggling. So, you know, maybe in March if Hong Kong can stabilize the situation, but if not, we're pushing this into the summer. And again, this will be done in stages. It won't be a dramatic announcement of zero COVID's over. It'll be a test. And then if that test works, another step and another step. Next question. Do you think China will be able to join the Cptpp as a way to demonstrate its regional influence? Again, this is, I should clarify, that's a political matter. I don't think China joining the Cptpp makes any difference to the region economically, just none. So, we're talking about what's going to happen in Asia in 2022. Some people might say, will China join the Cptpp? But when we say economically, it doesn't matter. That's my view, having read the document, both the RCEP and the Cptpp. As a political matter, I don't think it will work this year. There's a lot of hostility in the region, or a lot of tension in the region, I should say. It's very hard to look at Chinese sanctions in Australia and think I should sign a trade agreement with China. Now, some of the people listening might say Australia was out of line criticizing China over COVID. Again, that doesn't really matter. What matters is to CPTPP. What matters is If you sign an agreement with China and they're just going to break the agreement, if you criticize them, it reduces the value of signing an agreement with China. So I really don't see China being able to join the Cptpp this year. There's a lot of things that can happen. The Chinese economy could do better and then make it a more valuable partner. China could change its economic policies, not apologizing to Australia or anything like that, but just showing it's more committed to trade as opposed to sensitivity to political criticism. But right now, I don't see that happening. Can you please give a current Thai economy? A fair question, and the answer is no, I really can't. I mean, I can tell you what I read in the news, but I don't really know what's going on in the Thai economy. I was trying to give the other economies I mentioned some insight that isn't available if you read the news, and I don't have that with Thailand. I apologize. I was saying this to someone recently. They asked, like, do you know anything about the Ukraine crisis? No. China there's so much going on in China and US-China relations. It's really even hard for me to keep up with India and the VIP countries. So I apologize, I cannot. I've made mentions of Indonesia to move its capital city. Do you think this will endanger the Indonesian economy due to the debt occurred? Yes. I don't mean endanger like there's going to be some dramatic crisis. The press seems really likes drama. If something bad happens, it's a catastrophe. And if something good happens, it's amazing. Debt is usually a problem. It can be an acute problem, but before that, it's a problem of slowing down growth. Obviously, what Indonesia and many other countries that are still developing is they want the fastest income gains they can deliver to their population as possible. And what's going to happen with the decision to move the capital is a lot of money is going to be wasted, in my opinion, on that project that won't benefit very many people. It will benefit construction workers, which is fine, but you're going to incur a lot of debt because it's not a commercial project. It's not a project that's going to bring in a lot of money. It's a political event. And so that debt to me is going to be wasted capital that Indonesia really shouldn't waste. It should be devoted to other projects that will boost its income growth. So I worry that if that project goes along and takes a long time and it's very expensive and Indonesia runs a lot of debt, you're not going to have a crisis in Indonesia. You're going to have slower growth in Indonesia that you should have, and slower gains and slower movement towards prosperity. So I do think it's a danger. I hope it gets cut off, stopped, or shrunk. But I think probably it's going to be a weight weighing down the Indonesian economy. How will the demographic transition in Asia affect the rest of the world? Well, there are two different demographic transitions in Asia. Well, I guess there's only one transition. You're right, and I'm wrong. The transition in Asia is aging in Northeast Asia. That's the change. That first Japan was an old country, then South Korea was an old country, and now China is becoming an old country. There are still also young countries in Asia. I mentioned India and the VIP countries, Pakistan. There are other younger countries in Asia, Laos. So the transition is a negative because aging is a negative for economic dynamism. I mean, there can be some benefits. It's easier to find jobs and so on. But generally, it's a negative. And what we have, this is a very good question now that I think about it, putting aside the countries that are not in transition, what we've seen in Asia is Japan rises or re-rises. Japan was an advanced economy before World War II, re-rises after World War II with a young country, young labor force. And then as Japan starts to get older, it's replaced by Korea and the four dragons, which is Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. It's a weird group because Singapore is a small city, Hong Kong is a medium-sized city. But that's the grouping. They were able to offset some of the weakness in the Japanese economy as Japan aged. Then as Korea started to age, we had China booming and China being much bigger. That really transformed the global economy. Now, without China, as I said, China being an aging country that's going to grow more slowly, the obvious replacement is India. I don't think that's going to happen. If India can't do it, we really would hope that the younger countries in Southeast Asia, whose combined population is getting close to 500 million, not China, but also not small, could play that role. But the world faces challenges where labor supply is not going to be plentiful and prices could rise. East Asia has served the purpose over time, different countries are bringing cheap, high quality goods at low prices. And I think that's going to stop. And this current inflation is due to COVID and very loose US monetary policies, current inflation in the US and to some extent around the world. But there's a longer challenge of we had a replacement for Japan and then we had a replacement for the dragons. And now we don't really have a replacement for China. And so that is going to slow world growth or cause higher prices. These are great questions. Thank you for asking. Why do what do you think the US should fear most regarding potential economic threats from China and India? A lot of people in the US would be afraid that India will be a repeat of China, that it will be low-cost labor that will take American jobs. I don't think that's going to be true. India is farther away. It doesn't have the same logistics. It doesn't have, amazingly, it doesn't have as open a labor market as China. So I don't think Americans should be worried about that. On the Chinese side, I think that the threat is largely technological loss. China is very interested in acquiring foreign technology. They're not subtle about it. They say it. They would say they acquire foreign technology all by legitimate means. Their critics, which include me, would say that's not true. But in any case, that's what you're looking at. You're looking at a China that is trying to move up the value-added ladder, stop being at the end stage of supply chains and start being at the middle or even at the top, as they are in the chemical industry, and becoming a more advanced country that wins high value-added industries. And that's been the American advantage. The American advantage is agriculture to some extent, but even more than that, innovation. And China would say it's legitimately competing with America on innovation. Its critics, including me, would say it's illegitimately, to some extent, competing with America on innovation. But that's where the risk comes from. I don't think it's low-cost labor in India. I think it's China's legitimate innovation and China coercing foreign companies to transfer technology, and also China stealing technology. So that's where I would put the threat. Where am I? What country would you recommend doing business or entrepreneurship in, considering the current situation and future trends? Well, it depends on how risk acceptant you are. I used to make a joke when I was in the private sector that I tell entrepreneurs what to do, but I'm too scared to be an entrepreneur. And that's pretty much true. So if you're more like me and you're scared, I would do something that's a mortal lock. China old age services, going to be the biggest single market in the world by far. Huge senior population, going to grow for at least 2 more generations, going to need a lot, ideas, quality service, capital, you name it, certain kinds of technology. That is the guaranteed space where there's a good opportunity for business. And the Chinese government will welcome foreign participation, will welcome private sector Chinese participation, because it's going to need all the help it can get to deal with that aging population. If you are more of a risk taker than I am, I would look at Indonesia or the Philippines. Both of those countries have the potential for sustained rapid growth. They may fail. They haven't shown that they're willing to take those steps necessary. There are some Indian states, maybe certain parts of India's states can pursue to some extent independent economic policies. So those would be higher risk. China old age services is a lock. It won't expand as fast as some other countries might, but it is a huge market. And then if you're more willing to accept risk, I would look at Indonesia and the Philippines and Southeast Asia. And there are other places around the world that one could look at. I'm not an expert on those places, so I'm not answering the question outside of Asia. What perspectives on the outlook for Taiwan's economic health today and post-political reshuffle in Beijing? I actually do know something about Taiwan. So again, my apologies, the person who asked a very reasonable question about Thailand that I couldn't answer. Taiwan has done relatively well during COVID for a variety of reasons, and credit to Taiwan for that. They're in a difficult situation going forward. I don't think we can just have the same, as I said, I think the biggest trend here is deglobalization. Not that it will be complete, but partial deglobalization. I don't think supply chains can start with US design and run through Taiwanese manufacturing and include Chinese assembly and then head back out to the world. I don't think that's going to work anymore. So I think the US and China are going to tug Taiwan economically and probably politically in different directions. And it's going to require a lot of foresight and difficult choices on the part of the Taiwanese government. I mean, if you're not familiar with Taiwan, it's a wonderfully dynamic place, but it has 24 million people. It relies on the outside world, no natural resources, essentially. It relies on the outside world. So it can't just say, well, we'll make smart decisions and everything will be fine. That isn't true. A US-China economic tug of war is a big risk for Taiwan. And you don't have to decide, all these countries saying, oh, we have to decide between the US and China. Not really true, but you might have to decide industries. This industry, we have to decide between the US and China, and we're going to pick one or the other. And that's really where I think, because Taiwan is really a classic open economy that needs the world to thrive, and it's done a great job of that. Taiwan's going to have to look forward and decide, this is the future for key industries in Taiwan. It's a future tied to China. It's a future tied to the United States. Maybe they diversify and look for other markets like India, depending on the sector. But that to me is the risk to Taiwan after good economic management of COVID, in my view. What sparked your interest in the Chinese and Indian economies? Well, in China, I was writing my dissertation, and that happened to be I started working on it a few months after Deng Xiaoping's Southern tour. So if you don't know anything about Chinese economic history, recent Chinese economic history, Deng Xiaoping restarted economic reform in a fall visit to Guangdong, fall 1992 visit to Guangdong. I always tell this joke of, like, Deng Xiaoping I actually sort of met. Is a little guy saying, I'm gonna, we're restarting reform, or, you're going to prison. So it was a very dramatic restart, and it caught my attention. So basically I started on China because of the Southern tour. And then India came after that, because as China developed, I thought, will India be the next country like many other people? And could I bring the things I learned about China for 10 years, bring them to bear in India? I'm going to try to answer one more question quickly. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them. How are U.S. companies reacting to the decoupling effect that's taking place from zero COVID? How would you advise U.S. companies? China has become a less hospitable. I'm going to be very quick here, so I'm not going to do a great job answering your question. China has become a less hospitable country for foreign companies because of zero COVID, but also because China has been less hospitable to all private companies. There's been a lot of suspicion from the Chinese government aimed at private companies, foreign and Chinese. So, what the U.S. has to do, what U.S. companies have to do, is they have to decide, am I in a sector that's going to be growing rapidly in China, that the Chinese government trusts foreign participation, or not? You can't look to the past. You have to look to the future and make a hard choice. This is a great area in China going forward, not just going back, and I can operate there, and the Chinese government will not get angry at me. And the problem with companies is they tend to look backwards and say, well, it worked to now. And I really do think we're in a different situation, not just because of COVID. That will eventually end, hopefully sooner than later, but because the Chinese government has signaled that it doesn't trust the private sector in certain areas of the economy. Other areas, yes. And U.S. companies have to decide, are we in areas where we're trusted and where China will continue to grow well going forward? And I'm sorry if I went over, and I'm sorry about the last question, but thank you very much, and I hope you all have a good evening.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Scissors, for your enlightening insights regarding the Chinese economy, India, and the VIP countries, as well as thanking all of our audience for all these fantastic questions. I'm pretty sure that we all enjoy them. They're really good questions. I really enjoy them as well. So yeah, thank you again, Dr. Scissors, for your time tonight. And I just want to remind all of our participants tonight that before you leave today, we do have a survey that we're asking you to help us fill in. And by filling it out, you will automatically join our raffle for a free AirPods Pro. So please help us, just provide us some feedback so we can know how to improve better next time. And right, and at the same time, our finance panel will also start in 10 minutes at 8:10. So Cynthia, do you mind providing more details regarding that?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Daniel. And of course, thank you, Dr. Scissors, for the wonderful speech. I've actually just sent the link to the finance panel discussion, which will happen in 10 minutes. So if you guys are interested, please go ahead and switch to that Zoom link, and we'll see you guys there soon.
Thanks everyone for participating. Thank you so much, Dr. Scissors. It has been a very great half an hour, 40 minutes, just learning about your insights. Thank you so much.